Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into its weight. Allow your breathing to even out. There is no destination to reach tonight, no arrival to consider. The journey has already slowed. The path will carry itself. When you are ready, we begin. Tonight's story is called A Day in the Life of a Lighthouse Mechanic. The path that leads toward the lighthouse curves gently along the cliff's shoulder, its stones worn smooth not by hurry, but by repetition. Grass bends low in the wind, not flattened, simply inclined, as if it understands the rhythm of air that moves here each day without fail. The sea spreads wide below, a long slate surface broken only by the slow pulse of tide-meeting rock. It is not dramatic, it is thorough. The lighthouse rises ahead of you, pale against a sky that has not yet decided its evening color. Its walls are not bright white, but softened by salt and time, carrying the faint dullness of many seasons. There is something reassuring in that structures that endure rarely shine, they hold instead. The wind touches your coat as you walk, not pushing, only reminding. It carries the clean mineral scent of water and iron and stone. Somewhere below, waves fold against the cliff in an even cadence. You do not need to watch them to know their pattern. It has been repeating long before you arrived. The final stretch of the path narrows slightly. A low wall of stacked stone edges the drop, each block fitted with care. One corner bears a darker patch where rain collects briefly before slipping away. The small details here are unhurried, precise, unannounced. You reach the door at the base of the tower. It is heavy oak, reinforced by dark iron bands that have weathered into a deep matte finish. When your hand settles on the latch, the metal is cool, but not cold, nearly the temperature of your skin. The brass plate surrounding the keyhole holds a faint shine where it has been touched most often. Just below it, one small screw sits slightly worn smooth, as though a thumb has pressed there again and again over years without thought. The mark is barely visible. It feels steady beneath your fingers. The door opens with a measured weight. Hinges move without complaint. Inside, the air shifts, still touched by salt, but quieter, held within stone. The thickness of the walls changes the sound of your breathing. It seems closer, contained. The spiral stair begins immediately, rising in a slow curve along the inner wall. Each step is stone, slightly concave at the center from countless ascents. Your hand rests on the railing as you begin upward. The iron is solid, it does not flex. The motion of climbing is simple and deliberate. Step, turn, step. The repetition is not demanding, it is rhythmic. Light filters down from above in a narrow shaft, dust turning softly within it. The tower holds its own climate, a mixture of dry salt air and faint metal warmth. You can sense the height even before you reach the lantern room, the way sound shifts subtly with each turn of the stair. Halfway up, a small window set into the wall opens toward the sea. It is round, thick with glass. Through it, the horizon stretches unbroken. The sky widens there, expanding outward rather than upward. The wind brushes the exterior but does not enter. The tower keeps its stillness. You continue climbing. The curve of the stair seems to organize thought without effort. The outside world remains present, waves, wind, sky, but at a slight remove as though placed carefully just beyond the stone boundary. Inside, there is only ascent. At the top of the stair, the lantern room opens in a quiet circle of glass and metal. The lens stands at the center, tall and faceted, its surface catching what little light remains. Brass supports hold it in perfect balance. The floorboards beneath your feet are pale wood, faintly marked where boots have passed over decades. Near the edge of the room, one board bears a small indentation, not damage, simply a place worn smooth where someone once stood repeatedly while adjusting a fitting. The wood remembers pressure in its own quiet way. The glass panels surrounding the room curve gently outward, framing the vast horizon. From here, the sea does not feel distant. It feels wide. The air presses lightly against the panes, a constant exchange between interior calm and exterior movement. You move toward the lens, not hurried. The mechanism beneath it is visible, gears aligned, housing steady. Nothing demands attention, nothing insists. The day's work will be simple as it has always been: inspection, adjustment, care. The lighthouse does not rush toward night, it prepares for it. You rest your hand briefly against the cool brass frame of the lens. It holds the faint warmth of earlier light. The glass catches a pale reflection of the sky, now beginning to thin toward evening. Below, the tide shifts. You cannot hear it clearly from this height, but you sense the change in weight, the slight deepening of air pressure. The world beyond the tower continues its wide rotation. Inside, the lantern room remains contained. You stand for a moment without moving. The structure holds. The wind moves around it. The sea folds and unfolds below. There is nothing dramatic in this beginning, only presence. The day has already settled into its shape, and you are here within it. You move slowly around the perimeter of the lantern room, letting your hand rest lightly along the inner railing that circles the glass. The metal carries a faint residue of salt where the wind has pressed itself against the panes for years. It leaves no roughness, only a slight matte texture beneath your palm, as though the sea has brushed here often enough to soften everything it touches. Below the lens, the clockwork housing sits within its protective casing. The brass plate at its base bears small, shallow tool marks, precise, controlled reminders of adjustments made long ago. They are not visible unless you lean close. Even then, they appear less like scratches and more like faint signatures, evidence of hands that understood the rhythm of these gears intimately. A narrow shelf runs along the inner wall, holding a folded cloth, a small oil can, and a ledger with thick pages bound in dark cover. The edges of the ledger are worn slightly uneven, one corner rounded more than the others. It has been opened many times at the same place. The spine bends there more easily. There is something reassuring about objects that yield in familiar ways. You cross to the opposite window. From this angle, the cliff drops away more steeply, revealing a stretch of rock that curves outward before meeting the sea. Waves move in deliberate patterns, pressing in, drawing back, pressing again. The repetition is steady. It does not rush toward completion. The wind increases slightly, brushing the glass in a broad, low sweep. The structure absorbs it without strain. The tower has stood through stronger gusts than this. It does not react. It simply remains. You notice how the light has begun to lower, not dramatically, but by degrees. The color in the sky thins, losing brightness rather than warmth. The horizon line softens, blurring just enough that sea and sky appear to share a boundary rather than hold a firm division. The lens catches this shift, breaking it gently into fragments of pale gold and faint silver. A faint ticking emerges from within the mechanism, not loud, but present. It is the kind of sound that becomes noticeable only once you have stopped moving. The intervals between ticks are even. They do not call for attention. They merely continue. You step back toward the center of the room and allow your breathing to align with that subtle rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The pattern forms itself naturally, as if guided by the quiet precision of the gears below the lens. There is no need to match it exactly. The body finds its own pace. The air inside the lantern room feels slightly warmer than the stairwell below. It gathers here during the day and lingers as evening approaches. When you lower yourself into the small wooden chair positioned near the instrument panel, the seat accepts your weight without creak or complaint. The wood has adjusted to countless similar moments. Its surface carries a faint sheen where hands have rested along the backrest, smoothing the grain over time. From this vantage point, the world seems arranged rather than vast. Sea, sky, cliff, and wind move within the circumference of glass, contained in a circle that feels complete. The tower does not separate you from the horizon, it frames it. A gull crosses the field of view, wings steady, gliding rather than flapping. For a moment, its shadow skims across the glass before disappearing. The movement is brief. Then the air returns to its broader stillness. You sit without urgency, aware of height but not unsettled by it. The structure beneath you holds firm. The mechanism waits patient. The tide continues its measured exchange with the shore. There is a kind of quiet confidence in places like this, spaces built not for spectacle, but for constancy. The lighthouse does not seek attention, it keeps watch. The day rests in its final stretch, and the work, when it begins, will unfold just as steadily. The first task of the evening does not begin with movement, it begins with listening. You remain seated in the lantern room for a moment longer, allowing the ticking of the mechanism beneath the lens to settle into clear intervals. It is not loud enough to dominate the space, yet it carries through the still air with quiet certainty. Tick, a pause, tick. The sound feels less like an action and more like a continuation of something already in progress. Outside the glass, the sky lowers another shade. The line between water and air thins further, not disappearing, only softening. Far below, the sea presses against the rock in wide, unhurried motions. Each surge gathers, rounds, and eases back again, leaving a darker sheen across the cliff base. You rise from the chair and cross toward the clockwork housing. The brass casing reflects a muted glow from the last of the daylight. When you kneel beside it, the metal holds the faint warmth it gathered earlier. Your fingers rest lightly along the edge before lifting the latch. It clicks slightly off-center, a familiar sound, neither sharp nor dull, just precise. Inside, the gears move in careful relation to one another. Teeth meet. Release, meet again. The rhythm remains constant. You lean closer, not to inspect for fault, but to confirm what you already know. Everything is aligned. The pendulum arm swings in narrow arcs, measured and balanced. The air in the room carries a faint trace of oil and salt, not heavy, just enough to mark the place as functional rather than ornamental. You reach for the small oil can from the shelf and tilt it gently, letting a thin line fall along the pivot point. The liquid gathers, settles into the joint, and disappears between the metal seams. There is something reassuring about maintenance that asks only for attention, not urgency. You wipe the excess with the folded cloth. The cloth itself bears faint darker streaks from previous evenings, the fibers thickened where oil has absorbed and dried. The fabric bends easily in your hand, softened by repetition. The wind brushes the glass again, this time from the opposite direction. The panes answer with a low, steady tone, not a rattle, not a strain, just a broad resonance that fades almost immediately. You close the housing and rise, brushing your palms lightly against your trousers. A thin layer of salt dust catches the light along the windowsill nearest the sea-facing side. It forms uneven lines where the wind has pressed moisture against the glass and left its trace behind. You run a finger through one of those lines, clearing a small path. The salt leaves a faint white residue against your skin before dispersing. The mechanism continues beneath the lens, untroubled by the small adjustment. You cross to the instrument panel fixed against the inner wall. The gauges sit in a neat row: pressure, rotation timing, fuel reserve. Their needles rest at steady positions. Nothing leans too far in any direction. The dials have been polished over years of handling. The outer rims show a subtle dullness where hands have touched them repeatedly. You turn one knob half a degree. The change is almost imperceptible. The ticking shifts slightly in tone, not in speed, just in timbre, a faint smoothing of sound. Outside, a single buoy far off the coast rises and lowers against the swell. Its movement is slow enough that it feels less like motion and more like breathing. The horizon holds. You step toward the spiral staircase and begin your descent. The iron steps curve downward in a consistent arc, their surfaces worn smooth at the center from decades of measured use. Your hand rests along the inner rail as you descend, feeling the coolness of the metal beneath your palm. It does not chill. It simply carries the temperature of the air within the tower. Each step echoes softly against the stone walls, not loudly. The sound rounds itself before fading. Halfway down, a narrow window cuts into the outer wall. From here, the sea looks closer, though it remains distant enough to appear deliberate in its pacing. A wave gathers against a jut of rock, presses, releases, and thins back into the larger body. You continue downward until you reach the service level, a small chamber between the lantern room and the keeper's quarters below. Here, the air feels slightly heavier. Less wind reaches this depth. The walls retain a steady coolness even in warmer months. A wooden bench runs along one side of the room. Its surface shows a faint dent near the center where tools are often set down. The grain there has been worn into a smoother pattern, slightly darker than the surrounding wood. You rest the oil can on that exact spot without looking. The toolbox sits beneath the bench. You lift the lid and inspect its contents. Wrenches aligned, spare bolts arranged by size, a small brush for clearing salt residue from the lens housing, everything in its place. You select the brush and return to the stairwell, climbing once more toward the lantern room. The ascent requires no haste. The tower holds steady beneath each step. Back inside the lantern chamber, you move toward the outer edge of the lens apparatus. The glass segments are arranged in careful geometry, each facet angled to catch and project light across distance. A faint film of salt mist clings to the lower panes. You brush lightly along the surface. The bristles glide across the glass in slow arcs, lifting the thin layer without scraping. The movement produces a soft, whispering sound, barely audible above the steady ticking below. There is no urgency here, only sequence. You circle the lens, repeating the motion at each panel. The sky outside has lowered another degree, color thinning toward pale gray-blue. The first trace of evening deepens at the edges. When you finish, you set the brush back onto the shelf and pause again at the center of the room. The lantern has not yet been lit, but the preparation has already begun. The mechanism is primed. The glass is clear. The dials rest in balance. A faint mechanical hum adjusts within the housing, a small internal correction aligning the rotation timing. It is subtle. Contained, then still again. You step toward the western window and let your gaze rest outward. Far beyond the reef line, a cargo vessel moves slowly along the horizon, its outline softened by distance. It does not require the lighthouse yet, not fully, but it will. You remain standing there, not waiting, simply present within the space between daylight and illumination. The tide continues its patient exchange with the shore, and inside the tower, the work settles into readiness. You remain in the lantern room for a moment longer, allowing the rhythm of the mechanism to continue without interruption. The ticking beneath the lens does not vary. It keeps its measured interval, unaffected by the fading light outside or the deepening shade along the waterline. The evening does not arrive suddenly here. It gathers. You cross toward the narrow storage cabinet set into the inner curve of the wall. The hinges respond with a low, rounded sigh as you open it. Inside, the spare wicks are stacked in even rows, each rolled carefully and bound with thin twine. The twine has darkened slightly at the edges where fingers have handled it over the years. You lift one roll and unbind it slowly, letting the cotton length settle against your palm. The fibers feel dense and faintly cool. You draw it between your fingers, checking for uneven weave or loose thread. There is none. There's something reassuring about materials that behave exactly as they should. You set the wick aside on the small iron tray beside the burner assembly. The tray holds a faint scratch across its surface, a shallow line left long ago by a tool placed down without full care. It does not affect function. It simply exists. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, brushing the tower from the north. The glass answers with a soft change in tone, more of a low resonance than a sound. The sea responds in kind, waves pressing at a slightly different angle along the rock below. You move to the fuel reservoir and rest your hand lightly against its side. The metal carries a stable temperature, neither warm nor cold. You unfasten the cap and lean close enough to confirm the level. The scent of oil rises faintly, not sharp, just present, enough to mark the space as working rather than decorative. You refill the chamber with steady motion, pouring without haste. The liquid gathers at the base and settles into place. When you reseal the cap, it tightens with a clean turn. Tick, tick. The mechanism below continues, the pendulum arm drawing narrow arcs beneath the floorboards. You kneel briefly and press your palm flat against the wooden surface. The vibration is subtle, a faint tremor marking rotation through weight rather than noise. The tower breathes in its own way. You rise and cross to the outer rim of the lantern assembly, adjusting one of the brass brackets by a fraction. The bracket resists slightly before easing into alignment. A small click confirms the correction. A single gull calls from somewhere below, the sound carried upward in thin strands of air. It does not linger. It touches the tower and passes. You pause. The horizon now holds only the faintest remnant of daylight. The sky transitions into a deeper blue, the first star appearing almost reluctantly above the western edge. It brightens briefly as the last of the glare fades, then steadies into its fixed place. Inside, you lift the matchbox from the shelf. The wood casing is worn smooth at the corners. When you slide it open, the matches rest in a tidy row, heads aligned. You strike one. The flame gathers quickly, not flaring, simply rising into shape. You guide it toward the wick and allow the cotton to accept the light. It catches without hesitation. The flame narrows, steadies, and then extends upward in a controlled column. You adjust the wick height carefully, lowering it until the light holds a clean edge without smoke. The lens surrounding it begins its slow capture, refracting the glow outward through each angled pane. The first rotation carries the beam across the darkening sea. It sweeps once across the waterline, then continues its arc. There is no fanfare to the lighting of a lighthouse, no announcement, only continuation. You extinguish the match and place the spent stick into the small tin reserved for ash. The tin holds the faint smell of charred wood, subtle and dry. The rotation settles into rhythm. The beam now moves outward in measured intervals, crossing the reef, then the deeper water beyond. Somewhere beyond sight, it reaches vessels that will note its position without thinking about it. A steady signal, a known point. You circle the lantern slowly, observing the clarity of the projection. Each pane remains free of residue. The brushwork earlier has done its work. A faint ripple touches the rock below, slightly stronger than the previous tide cycle, and then eases back again. The tower remains unmoved. You descend halfway down the stairwell once more to check the weight system that drives the rotation. The heavy counterweight hangs within the shaft, descending gradually as the mechanism runs. Its chain moves almost silently, only a faint metallic glide marking its motion. You watch it for a moment. There is patience in systems like this. They do not rush toward completion. They operate within steady descent. You grasp the crank handle mounted beside the shaft and begin to wind the weight upward again. The motion is firm but unhurried. Each turn gathers resistance and releases it smoothly. The chain rises through the central column, the counterweight lifting toward its reset position. The action produces a low mechanical murmur, contained and rhythmic. Not loud enough to echo, just enough to confirm engagement. You complete the winding and secure the handle back into its bracket. The weight now rests high again, prepared for another cycle. Upstairs, the beam continues its arc. You return to the lantern room and stand once more at the window. The cargo vessel seen earlier has shifted further along the horizon. A faint answering light blinks in the distance, not in response to the lighthouse, simply existing in its own pattern. The air inside the chamber remains stable. The flame burns evenly. The gears maintain their pace. You move toward the small desk tucked against the inner wall and open the logbook. Its pages hold lines of entries written in careful script, each noting time, weather, and condition. You lift the pen and dip it lightly into the ink bottle. The nib scratches softly across the paper as you record the hour and the wind direction. The sound is delicate, almost private. A page turns. The ink settles into the grain of the paper without blotting. You close the book gently and return it to its place. The light continues to circle. Outside, darkness deepens across the sea. The beam now stands in clearer contrast against the night, cutting a measured path across the surface before thinning again into distance. You lean against the inner rail and allow your breathing to match the rhythm below: tick, arc, glide, return. The work is not dramatic. It does not escalate. It simply continues in alignment. And the lighthouse, now fully lit, holds its place between rock and sky. The beam completes another arc across the water, and the rotation settles into its established pace, not hurried, not hesitant. Each pass follows the last without deviation. The mechanism beneath the lantern room maintains its rhythm with quiet assurance, the pendulum tracing its measured sweep below the floor. You remain near the inner railing for a moment longer, listening to the layered sounds that now define the tower at night. Tick, a soft metal glide, the low wash of tide against rock. The faintest hum of flame held steady inside glass. None of it competes. Each element keeps to its own lane, as if long accustomed to sharing space without friction. You move slowly along the curved wall, fingertips brushing the painted surface as you walk. The paint carries a slight texture beneath your skin, faint ridges where earlier coats were laid down by careful hands. The tower has been tended to in cycles, scraped, sanded, painted again. The history of maintenance rests in thin layers you cannot see but can feel. There's something quietly reassuring about repetition that preserves rather than erodes. At the narrow shelf beneath the window, you lift the small brass polishing cloth and fold it once over your fingers. The cloth is soft from use, its edges frayed slightly where threads have loosened. You pass it lightly over the inner rim of the lens housing, not because it needs attention, but because the gesture itself affirms alignment. The brass reflects a muted halo of lamplight, brightening under the brief contact. Outside, the water shifts with the turning tide. The earlier outgoing current has softened. The sea now presses in with a slightly fuller rhythm, each wave climbing a fraction higher against the stone base before slipping back again. You rest your gaze outward. The horizon no longer holds color. It has become a single, deep tone, sky, and water blending at their seam. The only motion now visible is the brief silvering of wave crests as the beam passes over them. The tower's glass answers with a faint vibration when the wind brushes it at a new angle. The sound is thin but stable, like the low resonance of a held note. You step toward the central column and look down through the narrow gap between stairwell rails. The counterweight, recently wound, descends almost imperceptibly along the shaft. Its movement is slow enough that the eye cannot measure it directly. Yet you know it is lowering. You can feel it in the quiet pull beneath the mechanism's rhythm. You descend halfway down the iron steps, each footfall landing without echo. The interior stone of the tower absorbs sound rather than amplifying it. The steps themselves carry a faint scuff at the outer edge of each tread, a worn curve shaped by years of turning. The air grows marginally cooler as you lower through the shaft. At the weight assembly, you place your hand against the heavy cylinder. The metal is firm and still, though the chain above it glides in narrow increments. You follow the chain upward with your eyes, watching the small, evenly spaced links slide through their guides. The structure of it is simple: weight descending, gears turning, lens rotating, light sweeping. Nothing is wasted. You listen more closely now, isolating each sound from the composite hum. The pendulum's tick is steady, but not sharp. It carries a rounded edge, softened by wood and stone. The chain's motion produces a faint whispering friction. The wind against the tower shifts in low intervals. The tide presses, releases, presses again. There is no need to adjust anything. You return upward, one hand trailing lightly along the cool inner wall. The lantern room opens again around you: glass, brass, flame, sea. The flame remains even, its tip held at a height you set earlier. The lens captures it faithfully, dividing and magnifying its glow into measured beams. As the rotation carries the light outward, the glass panels catch fleeting reflections of your own silhouette before releasing it again. Identity flickers briefly in reflection and then thins. You step toward the outer window and rest both hands on the narrow sill. The wood beneath your palms has darkened slightly where countless hands have steadied themselves over years. A shallow dent marks the edge, worn smooth by repeated contact. The sea breathes in long intervals now. The returning tide gathers in deeper folds, the water pressing against submerged rock before sliding around it. The sound rises and settles without variation. You follow the arc of the beam as it sweeps the near shoreline, crosses the darker water beyond, and fades into distance. Then it returns. Arc, fade, return. Your breathing begins to mirror that rhythm without conscious adjustment. Inhale as the beam passes. Exhale as it thins. It is not intentional. It simply aligns. You shift slightly and draw the heavy curtain partway across one narrow pane, not fully closing it, only reducing the glare from within. The fabric moves with a low whisper. Its weave is thicker near the hem, where reinforcement threads gather into a subtle ridge. The curtain softens the interior light without altering the beam's outward projection. You lower yourself onto the small wooden stool positioned near the central column. The stool legs are uneven by a fraction, one shorter than the others. It settles with a faint, familiar wobble before finding balance. You rest there for a moment. The lighthouse does not require constant movement. Once set, it sustains itself through cycles you only monitor. The sky now carries a deeper tone. A thin band of lighter gray lingers low in the west, but it fades with each rotation of the beam. The first cluster of stars holds steady overhead, small and distant. You tilt your head slightly upward, watching the lens from beneath. The mechanics of it are precise. The frame supporting the glass panes remains perfectly aligned. The brass brackets hold firm. No drift, no deviation. You rise again and make a small adjustment to the vent near the top of the chamber, opening it by a narrow increment. The flame responds with the faintest elongation, then steadies. The air within the lantern room redistributes quietly. There's a kind of patience in systems that have run this long without interruption. You step toward the narrow rack where spare tools hang in careful order. A small wrench rests slightly off-center in its bracket. You nudge it back into alignment with 2 fingers. The metal answers with a soft click against the peg. The sound disappears into the room. The mechanism below ticks on. You circle the lantern once more, your steps tracing the curved perimeter. Each section of glass offers a different slice of night: open sea, jagged reef, distant horizon, and the faint blinking of far-off vessels. Nothing asks for attention. You return to the center of the room and stand quietly, allowing the layered rhythms to settle into a single field of sound. The lighthouse at night is less a structure and more a pulse. Weight descending, gears turning, flame holding, tide rising. The boundary between monitoring and simply being within it thins slightly here. You are not directing the system. You are present while it continues. The beam sweeps once more across the waterline. For a brief second, it illuminates the crest of a larger wave. The silver edge brightens, then fades as the arc completes. A faint mechanical hum adjusts, almost imperceptible, as the gear teeth settle deeper into alignment. You glance toward the logbook again, but do not move toward it. There is nothing new to record. Conditions remain stable. You lower your shoulders. The lantern room breathes in long intervals. Outside, the sea continues its measured rise. Inside, the flame maintains its narrow core of brightness. Beneath you, the weight descends through its quiet arc. Everything operates within a held pattern, and you remain within that pattern, neither initiating nor interrupting it, simply accompanying the slow rotation of light across dark water. The lens continues its turn, and as it does, you begin to notice the subtle difference between movement and motion. Movement is what the eye sees: the slow sweep of glass, the arc of brightness across the dark. Motion is what the body feels: the steady transfer of weight, the low hum threaded through the tower's spine. You remain still, yet something within you shifts in quiet sympathy. The beam passes again over the near water, revealing the surface not as a single plane, but as a layered texture: thin ripples crossing wider swells, each responding to the pull of tide beneath. For a brief second, the light catches the edge of a crest and turns it pale silver before letting it fall back into shadow. The sea does not rush its rising. It gathers. You draw a slow breath, and the air inside the lantern room carries the faint mineral tang of salt and warmed brass. The temperature has shifted by a fraction since earlier, cooler now, though not sharply so. The difference is enough to notice, not enough to disrupt. You step toward the center column once more and rest your fingers against the narrow seam where 2 sections of metal meet. The join is almost invisible, but you can trace it by touch. A faint ridge remains beneath the smooth paint, a reminder that parts assembled over time still carry their meeting points. There's something quietly steadying about that. The pendulum below continues its measured swing. You cannot see it from here, but its rhythm travels upward through floor and stair, rising in subtle vibrations that register more in bone than in ear. Tick, pause, tick. The lighthouse does not think about the sea. It does not anticipate the next wave. It responds only to the pull it is already in. You stand within that same pull now, not directing it, not resisting it, simply occupying the space where mechanics and tide share a common pace. The beam widens across the horizon again, touching distant water, then narrowing as it returns. The cycle remains unbroken, and in that repetition, Your sense of standing apart from the turning glass softens slightly, not dissolved, not gone, simply eased. The system turns, you remain. The difference feels smaller than before. The rotation continues without interruption. From where you stand, the movement of the lens feels both immense and delicate, great panes of curved glass turning on their axis with the steadiness of a clock hand. Each prism gathers the flame's narrow brightness and stretches it outward into a long, defined sweep. The sea receives it. Then it releases it again. You move closer to the central column and rest your palm lightly against the metal casing that houses the main gear assembly. The surface is cool. Beneath it, the teeth engage and disengage in measured sequence, not loudly, not forcefully. Just enough contact to carry momentum forward. There's something reassuring about machinery that does exactly what it was built to do. You kneel briefly beside the lower access panel and loosen the small latch. It opens with a subdued click, slightly off-center, a familiar sound that always resolves into place once seated again. Inside, the gears turn with a faint sheen of oil reflecting lantern light. The lubrication remains evenly distributed along each ridge, thin but sufficient. You watch the interaction for a moment. Teeth align, weight pulls, rotation follows. The system does not rush to complete its cycle. It simply honors the one it is in. You close the panel and secure the latch, fingers pressing it until the click settles into its usual tone. The sound merges with the pendulum's tick below, a steady undercurrent threading through the structure. The tide outside grows fuller. The earlier retreat has reversed completely now. The sea presses higher against the stone base, its voice deepening by a subtle degree. Each wave carries more body than before. When the beam passes over the near water, the ripples appear thicker, their silver edges wider before slipping back into shadow. You cross to the far window and open it by a narrow inch. Air moves through the lantern room with a cool, saline edge. It gathers in slow currents around the lens housing, lifts the edge of your sleeve, then thins again. The flame remains stable, though it responds with a slight narrowing before regaining its previous shape. You watch the reaction carefully. Adjustment, compensation, balance restored. The lighthouse does not resist change. It absorbs it, recalibrates, and continues. You return to the stool and sit for a moment, feet planted on the worn wooden boards. The floor carries faint arcs where boots have pivoted over decades, subtle crescents worn into varnish by repetition. A shallow groove traces the path between the tool rack and the stairwell entrance. Patterns reveal themselves when the pace is slow enough. The beam sweeps again, its light tracing the surface of the rising tide. For a brief second, it catches the spray thrown upward by a larger wave. The droplets glitter and vanish almost instantly. You breathe in as the arc widens. You breathe out as it thins. The rhythm holds. From below, the pendulum marks its intervals with patient precision. You imagine its slow swing in the lower chamber, carving equal segments of time that carry upward into motion. Time inside a lighthouse does not move in hours. It moves in arcs. You stand and begin a measured circuit around the lantern room, fingertips grazing brass brackets and narrow supports as you pass. The metal retains the memory of earlier warmth, but cools gradually under the open window's influence. Near the eastern pane, a faint streak marks the glass where salt once dried and was later cleaned. The trace remains, barely visible unless the light strikes at an angle. You pause there, watching the beam pass through that pane. For a fraction of a second, the streak refracts the light into a thin, softened edge, not enough to alter its outward reach, just enough to shift its internal reflection. Small imperfections rarely interfere with function. They simply change texture. You step back toward the center, lifting the small oil can from its place on the shelf. Its spout is narrow, curved gently downward. You tilt it carefully and allow a single drop to fall onto the secondary pivot point. The metal absorbs it immediately. The faint metallic whisper softens by an increment you can feel more than hear. The can returns to its hook with a quiet tap. The lantern room settles again into its composite hum. Outside, the horizon line has darkened into a deeper shade. The first scattering of brighter stars holds steady overhead. Far to the south, a distant vessel marks its position with a low blinking light, regular, restrained. The beam crosses it briefly. The two lights acknowledge one another for a moment before the arc continues on. You rest your forearms on the inner railing and lean slightly forward, observing the water's surface more closely. The tide has begun to smooth the earlier irregular ripples. The returning current fills hollows and levels troughs. What was once broken becomes more continuous. The sea finds its level. You lower your gaze to the base of the tower, where darker water presses against submerged rock. Foam gathers, then thins, then gathers again in repeating patterns. The sound is fuller now, less brittle than earlier in the evening. The tower absorbs the impact without reaction. You move back to the stairwell opening and begin descending slowly. Each iron step meets your weight with a muted tone. The air cools incrementally with each rotation of the stair. Halfway down, you pause and listen upward. The faint whir of rotation filters through the floor above, blending with the pendulum's measured tick below. Between those two rhythms, the descending weight and the sweeping beam, you stand suspended in their quiet intersection. You continue downward to the mechanism chamber, where the counterweight now hangs lower than before. Its surface shows faint scuffs where it has brushed the inner guide rails over years of motion. The chain above it glides through narrow channels, each link catching light for a fraction of a second before disappearing into shadow. You rest your palm against the weight again. It carries a subtle vibration, not tremor, not shake, simply the transferred energy of gravity moving through engineered channels. There's a kind of calm in systems that lean into gravity instead of resisting it. You glance at the winding handle mounted near the wall. There is no need to engage it yet. The weight has distance left to descend before reset becomes necessary. You remain still for a moment longer, listening to the layered architecture of motion. Tick, glide, turn. The rhythm requires no supervision beyond presence. You ascend once more to the lantern room, the spiral staircase narrowing your field of view until the glass chamber opens around you again. The beam sweeps. The tide rises. The flame holds its narrow core of brightness. You move to the western pane and adjust the curtains slightly, allowing a fraction more interior glow to reflect across the brass housing. The light within the room becomes marginally warmer, contrasting gently with the cool darkness outside. Balance between inside and outside shifts by a degree. You sit again on the stool and allow your posture to soften. The lighthouse continues its cycles without interruption. The rising tide finds the stone. The weight descends, the gears engage. The beam widens across the dark water, illuminating the returning current in long silver bands. Arc, fade, return. You notice that your breathing has aligned fully now with the sweep of light. It happens without intention. The body mirrors what it inhabits. You rest your hands loosely on your knees and allow your gaze to hover somewhere between the rotating lens and the horizon beyond. The structure holds. The sea gathers. The mechanism turns in its unbroken rhythm. And within that measured repetition, the boundary between caretaker and system grows thinner, not erased, simply less distinct, as if you are standing inside the lighthouse's breath rather than beside it. The oil you applied earlier has settled fully now, spreading in an invisible film along the pivot's edge. The The faint metallic whisper that once lingered has faded into the broader hum of rotation. You stand near the mechanism chamber door and listen. The sound is layered, not loud, not thin, but composed of multiple quiet elements resting together. Chain gliding, gear teeth meeting, pendulum marking, wind brushing the tower's outer wall. No one element dominates, they share the space. You place your hand lightly against the interior wall and feel the subtle vibration carried through stone. It is not tremor. It is continuity, the transmission of movement through structure. The tide has risen further now. Its earlier sharpness has rounded into something fuller, the waves pressing more evenly against rock. The sound from below has shifted from brittle break to deeper wash. The difference is slight but perceptible. Everything finds its level eventually. You close your eyes for a moment, not to withdraw, but to notice what remains without sight. The beam still turns. The weight still descends. The air still moves faintly through the narrow window above. Even without watching, the system continues. You open your eyes again as the light passes across the far pane. The faint salt streak there refracts the beam once more, bending its internal glow by a fraction before releasing it outward unchanged. Imperfection rarely halts function. It only alters the texture of passage. You take one slow step toward the stairwell opening and pause at its edge. The iron steps curve downward in a narrowing spiral, disappearing into shadow where the pendulum swings unseen. You do not descend. You remain where rotation and gravity meet. The counterweight lowers another few inches, its surface catching lantern light before returning to muted tone. The chain glides through its guide channel with measured ease. No urgency. No delay, just continuation. The beam sweeps again, and this time, as it reaches its farthest arc, you notice how the horizon does not break beneath it. The sea accepts the light without resistance, holds it for a moment, then releases it back into dark. There's something reassuring about that exchange, illumination offered, received, and let go without strain. You breathe in as the arc widens. You breathe out as it narrows. And somewhere within the repetition of gear and tide and pendulum, the sense of being the one who oversees begins to thin, replaced not by absence, but by participation. The lighthouse turns. The sea rises, and you stand within both motions at once. The tower holds its rhythm. You no longer monitor it in the same deliberate way. The inspection has been done. The small adjustments have settled. The mechanisms continue their patient rotation without requiring your constant attention. And so your stance shifts almost imperceptibly, not from duty to idleness, but from oversight to presence. You move toward the outer railing of the lantern room and rest your hands lightly against the cool metal curve. The glass beyond it bends the horizon slightly, giving the sea a subtle curvature it does not possess in open view. Through this arc of thick pane, the world appears steadier than it might from shore. The beam passes once more, cutting a clean path across water that has now risen closer to the base rock. Where earlier the tide pressed in uneven strokes, it now gathers in fuller swells, their surfaces smoothing as they approach. There is something reassuring about repetition that does not demand your intervention. The weight descends another measure. Tick. You glance toward the central column and watch the narrow brass fittings move through their circular route. They are neither hurried nor slow. They are simply committed to the path set for them. Even the faint friction between parts has settled into harmony. You take one step along the inner curve of the lantern room. The floor beneath your boots carries a faint memory of countless rotations, a softened polish where previous hands and feet have stood. Near the outer rim, just beside the railing seam, a shallow dent has worn smooth over years of quiet lining. Your fingers rest briefly in that familiar hollow. It fits. You remain there for a moment longer than necessary. The air inside the lantern room shifts again, a small exchange through the vented opening near the ceiling. A narrow thread of cooler air slides downward, touches your cheek, then disperses along the warm metal surfaces. The contrast is slight but distinct. The sea responds in its own way. From this height, you can now see the tide reaching a broader stretch of rock shelf than before. Dark patches once exposed are submerged in a thin sheen of moving water, their edges blurred by reflection. The beam passes. Light catches the wet surface and turns it briefly luminous, not bright, not dazzling, simply revealed. Then shadow returns. You do not anticipate the next arc. You no longer count the seconds between sweeps. The lighthouse turns whether you track it or not. There's a quiet relief in that. You step back from the railing and let your shoulders lower. The small tension that accompanied earlier checks, barely noticeable at the time, has thinned now. Your hands rest loosely at your sides. Below, the pendulum continues its steady descent. The chain glides through its guide channel, the links brushing metal in a measured rhythm. That sound, once distinct, has merged into the broader hum of the tower's interior. You descend a few steps down the spiral staircase, not to inspect, but to feel the transition in sound. As you move lower, the mechanical tones deepen slightly, the rotation overhead blending with the grounded weight below. Each level of the tower carries a different register of the same motion. You pause halfway between floors and rest your palm against the inner wall. The stone is cool. It has absorbed the evening's drop in temperature more quickly than the metal above. Its surface holds faint irregularities, shallow pitting where time and salt have etched small patterns. Your breath slows without instruction. The tower does not require you to think about the sea now. It is already responding to it, compensating for wind pressure, maintaining the arc of light, holding its structure against the steady rise. You ascend again, returning to the lantern room. The beam meets you at the threshold, washing briefly across your sleeve before widening toward the horizon. There is no sharp edge between inside and outside here. The glass mediates the boundary, bending scale, but not separating it. You remain within the same motion the sea inhabits. The tide has nearly reached its high point now. Its earlier urgency has eased into fullness. Waves that once struck in separate intervals now arrive in broader, more unified swells. The foam at their edges appears softer from this height, less fractured. A single gull crosses the beam's path briefly, its wings cutting through light and shadow before it disappears beyond the arc. The moment is contained, no sudden startle, only a fleeting shape acknowledged and gone. The mechanism continues. You sit for a moment on the narrow bench fixed against the inner wall. The wood carries a faint crease along its center, a shallow indentation worn smooth by repeated use. It is not deep enough to be called damage. It is simply where weight has rested before. Your own weight settles into it now. The tower does not quiet as you sit. It maintains its rhythm without alteration. The beam sweeps. The pendulum swings. The tide presses. The wind touches stone. You are no longer the sole agent of maintenance. You are one element within a structure that moves whether you sit or stand. There's something steadying about systems that do not depend entirely on you. The oil lamp near the lower chamber flickers once, not from instability, but from the shift in air pressure as wind brushes the outer walls. The flame steadies immediately. Its small movement does not disrupt the broader cadence. You close your eyes briefly and notice how the rotation remains perceptible even without sight. The faint warmth of passing light registers against your eyelids. The hum travels through floorboards and bench. The weight below marks time without announcing it. You open your eyes again as the beam narrows toward its inward arc. The horizon has grown darker now, the line between sea and sky less defined. From here, the distinction feels less important. Both carry the same deepening tone. The lighthouse does not brighten in response. It remains constant. You stand once more and approach the central column, placing your hand lightly against the smooth brass housing. The metal holds a residual warmth from prolonged rotation, not hot, not cold, simply active. The difference between you and the machine feels less pronounced than it did earlier. Not erased, just less pronounced. The chain lowers another increment. Tick. The sea presses upward and then relaxes, its surface smoothing as it reaches the outer rock ring. The earlier chop has eased into something broader, almost tidal in breath. You match it without trying. Inhale as the swell rises. Exhale as it falls. There is no need to align yourself deliberately. The rhythm is already present. You move once more to the outer railing and look outward, though looking now feels less like observing and more like resting your gaze within distance. The beam arcs again, and this time you notice how the light does not appear to originate from a single point. It expands from the lens outward, widening gradually before narrowing again, as though breathing in its own cycle. The lighthouse does not conquer darkness, it shares space with it. And within that shared space, you remain not directing the motion, not analyzing its precision, simply inhabiting the turn. The tide has reached its fullest height. The outer rocks are almost entirely submerged. Only the tallest ridges remain visible, their edges gleaming briefly when the beam passes. Soon, the tide will begin its slow retreat. But that movement is not yours to manage. You remain within the arc. The mechanism continues. The sea responds. The air shifts, and something within you, once separate, once alert in oversight, settles into participation instead. The lighthouse turns. You turn with it. The distinction grows quieter. The tower keeps its rotation. You do not mark the transition from one arc to the next anymore. The sweep of light passes across the horizon and returns, and somewhere between those movements, the sense of overseeing has thinned. You stand near the railing, but standing now feels less like posture and more like quiet balance. Below, the weight continues its measured descent. The chain slips through its guide with a subdued metallic hush. The pendulum maintains its unwavering path. None of it strains, none of it hesitates. The tide has reached its full height. Water presses close to the base of the rock, rising into the crevices that earlier lay exposed. From above, the surface appears almost unified, fewer sharp breaks, fewer scattered patches of foam. The sea seems to have gathered itself. The beam moves again. Light crosses the water and narrows along the distant line where sea meets sky. For a moment, that line glows faintly. Then it returns to shadow. You rest your palm against the glass. It is cooler now. The air outside has shifted further toward night. The contrast between interior warmth and exterior cool has softened into equilibrium. The tower does not resist the night. It simply continues. You take a slow step along the circular path of the lantern room, following the curve without conscious intention. The floor carries your movement easily. The faint scuff where countless boots have turned near the hinge of the access door catches a slight sheen as the beam passes. That mark has been there longer than your shift tonight. It does not announce itself. It simply remains. The lighthouse turns. You begin to notice how the movement is no longer something you track from outside. The rotation carries through the floor, into the railing, into the glass, into the air itself. Even the faint hum of the machinery has blended into a steady presence that feels less mechanical and more atmospheric. The mechanism is not separate from the tower. The tower is not separate from the sea. The sea is not separate from the darkening sky. And you remain within that arrangement, not directing it, not analyzing it, simply included. A narrow breath of wind brushes the outer pane. The glass responds with a faint tremor that disappears almost as soon as it forms. Inside, nothing shifts. The beam widens again, touches the upper edge of the waterline, then glides onward. You sit briefly on the bench near the central column. The wood receives your weight without adjustment. The shallow indentation worn into its center aligns with the curve of your back. It fits without effort. The air inside the lantern room has cooled another measure. The warmth from the earlier day has settled lower, held in metal and stone, but no longer rising. The temperature now feels even, neither drawing attention nor fading from awareness. Below, the pendulum completes another arc. Tick. You do not need to descend to confirm it. The sound reaches you clearly, traveling through the core of the tower and diffusing outward. The tide begins its retreat, so gradually that it is difficult to perceive the exact moment of reversal. The water that pressed firmly against the rock now eases back by fractions. A thin line of exposed stone reappears near the outer edge, dark and glistening. The sea does not withdraw abruptly. It rounds its edges and lowers almost imperceptibly. There is something steadying about rhythms that do not depend on urgency. You stand again and approach the central mechanism. The brass housing reflects a faint curve of light as it passes. You place your hand lightly against its surface. The warmth is consistent. The motion beneath your palm is steady, but restrained, no jolt, no irregularity. You feel the rotation more than you see it. The beam completes another turn. Light moves across the horizon, across water, across air. It does not search. It does not strain. It completes its arc and returns. The lighthouse does not dominate the dark. It inhabits it. You find yourself breathing in time with the motion, not deliberately, not in synchronized count, simply settling into the pace that has been present all along. The outer world has grown deeper in tone now. The sky holds fewer lingering traces of earlier color. The line between water and distance has blurred into layered shadow. Inside, the glow of the lantern remains constant. You lean lightly against the railing and look outward again. From this height, the sea's retreat is more visible now. The thin band of exposed rock widens. Water that once covered it now slides back in shallow sheets, leaving behind a faint reflective sheen before draining away. The tide does not resist its own lowering. The pendulum continues. Tick. You descend a few steps into the spiral, pausing midway where the sound of the machinery shifts register. At this level, the hum deepens slightly, resonating through the stone walls with a softened vibration. Your hand traces the inner curve of the wall as you move. The stone holds a faint irregularity where salt has etched shallow lines into its surface over years. It is not rough enough to catch the skin, but it carries a memory of weather. There's a kind of patience in stone that has endured repetition. You ascend again to the lantern room. The transition between levels feels seamless, no break in rhythm, only a slight adjustment in tone. The beam sweeps, the sea lowers, the chain descends. The elements continue without commentary. You sit once more, this time not out of rest, but out of quiet recognition that standing or sitting makes little difference to the motion around you. The bench receives you as before. The shallow indentation aligns again. The tower does not shift to accommodate you. You adjust within it. The wind brushes the outer pane once more, this time softer than before. The glass hums faintly in response, then stills. The air inside carries a subtle scent of oil and warmed metal, now faint rather than pronounced. It mingles with the salt that seeps upward through unseen cracks in the stone. The blend is neither sharp nor heavy. It simply exists. The beam completes another rotation, and this time you notice how the light does not appear as a single solid column. It contains subtle gradations, a brighter center tapering outward into softer glow. The edges feather slightly before fading into dark. Nothing about it demands attention. The tide continues its measured retreat. More of the rock face emerges, darkened by water, but slowly drying in the moving air. The exposed surface reflects the lantern's glow in scattered patches. The sea does not protest the lowering. It releases, your shoulders lower with it. The pendulum marks another descent. Tick. The weight is nearing the lower end of its track. You are aware of it without checking. Soon, you will need to rewind it, but that moment remains distant, not urgent, not pressing. The tower has time. You remain within that time. The mechanism rotates. The air settles. The sea eases. The distinction between your presence and the tower's motion grows quieter still. You are not directing the beam. You are not guiding the tide. You are not correcting the wind. You are within the rhythm that has always moved, whether you stand here or not. The lighthouse turns. The night deepens. And you remain not apart from it, but carried gently within its arc. The rotation continues without pause. You remain near the center of the lantern room, not fixed in place, but held within a pattern that no longer feels external. The beam glides across the dark in its measured arc, and the movement seems less like something happening before you and more like something passing through the same field you occupy. The tide below has withdrawn another quiet measure. Rock that was submerged an hour ago now lies exposed, slick, and reflective, holding thin pools that catch the passing light. When the beam reaches them, each shallow hollow answers with a muted shimmer before dimming again. The sea does not empty, it reshapes. You lean lightly against the inner railing. The metal feels cooler now, almost indistinguishable from the air itself. The temperature inside and outside has come closer to agreement. The difference between glass and sky feels less pronounced. The pendulum marks its steady arc below. Tick. There is no tension in the sound, no insistence. It carries upward through the stone, diffused into something softer by the time it reaches you. You step slowly along the circular path, allowing your movement to follow the curve rather than cut across it. The floorboards hold a faint unevenness near the outer edge where years of rotation have worn a subtle track. Your boot crosses it without hesitation. It has been there long enough to feel inevitable. The beam widens again, crossing the waterline that has shifted lower still. The dark beyond remains vast, but it no longer feels distant. It feels continuous. You pause at the window and rest your palm against the glass once more. The surface has cooled further. The faint condensation that earlier marked the edge between warmth and air has thinned until it is barely perceptible. Inside, the machinery hums at the same restrained pitch. The gears mesh with quiet assurance. The rotation is neither hurried nor slow, it simply maintains. There is something steadying about systems that do not fluctuate for the sake of attention. You notice how your breathing has adjusted again, not in counted rhythm, not in deliberate alignment, but in response to the turning arc. Each sweep of light feels like an exhale extended across distance. The beam moves, the sea settles, the tower turns. A narrow gust brushes the glass, this time softer than before, more like a passing thought than a movement of air. The outer surface answers with the faintest tremor. It fades quickly. You descend a few steps into the spiral stair, drawn not by necessity, but by a quiet awareness of the mechanism's presence below. The stone wall curves around you, holding a faint scent of salt and cooled metal. Halfway down, you pause. From this vantage, the pendulum's motion is clearer, the long brass rod gliding in its unwavering arc. The weight continues its descent through the shaft, nearing the lower reaches. The chain slips steadily through its guide, a faint metallic whisper that blends with the broader hum of the gears. Nothing strains. You place your hand lightly against the inner wall. The stone carries a subtle dampness where the night air has settled. The texture beneath your palm is faintly irregular, a shallow indentation worn smooth by hands that have rested here over decades. It fits your touch without resistance. You ascend again, the lantern room receiving you with its measured glow. The beam completes another sweep across the dark horizon. You realize how little separation remains between observing and being within. The act of watching has softened into something less defined. The rotation continues whether you focus on it or not. The tide below continues to lower. The exposed rock has widened into a band that curves gently around the base of the tower. Thin channels of water slip through the uneven stone, draining back toward the open sea in narrow, reflective threads. The sound of that movement does not reach this height distinctly. It is sensed rather than heard. You step back from the window and allow your gaze to soften, not fixed on any one point. The interior glow of the lantern diffuses slightly in your vision, the edges of objects less defined than before. The railing, the central column, the brass housing, all remain where they have always been, yet their outlines feel less rigid. You move toward the central mechanism once more. The brass casing reflects a muted version of your form as the beam passes. It does not distort, it simply carries the faint curve of your presence and releases it again. The gears within maintain their alignment. You rest your fingers lightly against the housing and feel the restrained vibration beneath the surface. It is not forceful, it is continuous. The pendulum marks another arc. Tick. The sound seems further away now, though you know the distance has not changed. It is as if the space between you and the mechanism has thinned into something more permeable. The tower holds. The sea recedes. The wind eases. The boundary between interior and exterior has softened almost imperceptibly. The lantern room does not feel enclosed. It feels suspended within the same field as the dark beyond. You walk once more along the circular path, your steps following the arc without thought. The worn patch near the door hinge glows faintly as the beam sweeps past, then returns to shadow. You pause there, allowing your hand to rest against the door frame. The wood carries a shallow notch just below the latch, a mark carved long ago, now smoothed by time. Your thumb fits into it without effort. It is not decorative. It is simply there. The beam crosses the horizon again. The sky has deepened into full night now. The last traces of earlier color have withdrawn. What remains is a layered darkness that holds depth rather than emptiness. The tide continues its measured retreat, though the movement is subtler now. The exposed rock glistens under the rotating light. Small pools remain in depressions, each catching the beam briefly before dimming. You feel less inclined to track these changes actively. They register and release without needing to be named. The mechanism turns, the air settles, the pendulum glides. Your stance shifts slightly, not to correct balance, but to accommodate a quiet awareness that standing or sitting has become nearly indistinguishable. The bench behind you remains where it was. The railing curves steadily. Nothing in the tower demands attention. You lower yourself once more onto the bench, this time with no sense of pause in the rhythm around you. The wood supports you with the same worn indentation. The slight warmth that remains in the metal of the railing fades further. The hum of the gears feels less mechanical and more atmospheric, as though the tower itself breathes in rotation. There is something quietly reassuring about repetition that does not escalate. The beam sweeps again. The pendulum ticks. The sea lowers by another fraction. The tower continues its steady function without drawing focus to itself. It does not perform, it persists. Your breathing aligns more fully now with the motion, though you are not directing it. Each arc of light corresponds to a widening of awareness that no longer feels centered in one place. You are not separate from the turning. The lighthouse is not separate from the night. The night is not separate from the sea. And you remain within that continuity, not overseeing, not correcting, simply present. The wind brushes the glass one last time in the stretch, softer still. The pain hums faintly, then quiets. The air holds steady. The tide has retreated far enough now that the sound of water slipping between rocks grows fainter, absorbed by distance. The exposed stone appears darker, matte rather than reflective. The beam passes over it. Light widens, narrows, returns. You do not follow it with your eyes anymore. You allow it to move across the periphery of awareness like a slow current that no longer requires attention. The pendulum marks its arc again. Tick. Soon the weight will need to be rewound. But that moment is still held in the distance, not yet approaching. For now, everything continues. The tower turns. The sea breathes outward. The night gathers further depth. And you remain within the rotation, carried by a motion that no longer feels like something you tend, but something you inhabit. The rotation continues, though it feels less like movement now and more like a condition. The lantern room no longer seems suspended above the sea, so much as threaded into it. The beam glides outward, yet the dark it crosses does not feel distant. It feels continuous, like fabric drawn slowly across a wide loom. You stand without noticing when you rose. The floor beneath your boots holds steady. The boards no longer announce their grain or texture distinctly. They simply receive your weight. The faint unevenness near the outer curve still exists, but it no longer interrupts the rhythm of your steps. The sea has withdrawn to its quietest point. Far below, the waterline rests against stone that has not felt air for hours. The exposed rock glistens faintly in the rotating light, not brightly, not sharply, just enough to acknowledge the passing beam. Light arrives. Light passes. Nothing resists it. The pendulum marks its arc below, though the sound has softened into something almost internal. Tick. The sound feels less like an external measurement and more like a small alignment within your chest, a gentle calibration that does not require thought. You move toward the window once more, though move feels imprecise. It is closer to settling closer to the glass, allowing the field beyond to widen around you. The horizon line has dissolved into darkness. The sky and the sea are no longer distinct planes, but a shared depth of tone. Only when the beam crosses do their subtle differences become visible. You rest your hand against the glass again. It is cool, not cold. The difference between your skin and the pane feels smaller than before. For a moment, the reflection of the lantern behind you overlays the night beyond, and the interior light becomes indistinguishable from the exterior beam. Inside and outside do not argue, they coexist. You let your gaze soften until the sharpness of edges reduces slightly. The railing, the brass housing, the stone column, all remain present, yet their boundaries blur at the edges of awareness. The lighthouse does not feel like a structure standing against the sea. It feels like an extension of the coastline itself, vertical instead of horizontal, but rooted in the same rhythm. The tide has reached its lowest reach. Water rests in deeper channels now, still and reflective. The exposed stone carries a faint sheen where the beam crosses it. When the light passes on, the rock returns to shadow without holding the brightness. There is something calming about surfaces that do not cling to illumination. The gears continue their steady mesh. The restrained vibration beneath the brass casing remains consistent, neither rising nor falling. You step toward the center of the room again, drawn not by duty, but by the steady hum at its core. The mechanism turns with the same measured pace it has kept all evening. You place your palm lightly against the housing. The vibration feels like a quiet undercurrent, constant, low, reliable. You close your eyes briefly. Even without sight, the rotation remains perceptible. The sweep of light can be sensed in the faint warming of air as it crosses the glass, in the subtle shift of brightness through closed lids. The pendulum continues. Tick. The sound lands softly, not as a marker of time, but as a reassurance of continuity. You open your eyes again, though the difference between closed and open feels smaller now. The lantern room holds its dim glow. The beam moves outward. The wind has eased further. The glass no longer trembles at all. The air inside the tower feels level, neither rising nor cooling significantly. You notice a narrow scratch along the inner railing, a faint, curved line in the paint where a tool must have brushed against it long ago. The mark has softened with years of contact, its edges rounded until it feels more like texture than damage. You trace it lightly with your fingertip. It does not interrupt anything. It simply exists. The rotation continues. The sea waits at its lowest point. The night deepens without effort. You begin to feel less like the one maintaining the lighthouse and more like a point within its motion, as though the mechanism and the tide and your breathing are variations of the same measured arc. You walk slowly around the circular path once more, though the path itself seems less defined. Each step feels less like locomotion and more like an adjustment within a stable field. The beam crosses the sea. The rock glows briefly. The light moves on. You pause near the door and rest your hand again against the worn notch beneath the latch. The indentation feels familiar now, not because you have stood here often, but because the tower itself feels known. There is a kind of patience in structures that endure without display. You step back toward the window. The sky holds no stars at this angle, only layered dark. Yet the darkness does not feel empty. It feels full, not crowded, not busy, simply present. You notice how little difference there is now between watching the beam and sensing its presence indirectly. Your eyes do not need to follow its full arc. You trust its return. The pendulum marks another arc. Tick. The sound seems to land closer, not louder, just nearer to where you stand. As though the mechanism's rhythm has shifted from echoing in the tower to echoing within you. You breathe, the inhale widens, the exhale eases, no instruction, no counting, just continuation. The tide begins its slow reversal, though it is almost imperceptible. A thin ribbon of water slips back across the lowest rock, reclaiming what was exposed. The change is subtle, so gradual it could be mistaken for stillness. You do not track it actively. You allow it to occur. The beam reaches the returning water and reflects faintly again, though softer now, less a shimmer, more a quiet acknowledgement. The lighthouse does not respond to this shift. It maintains its rotation with equal steadiness at high tide and low. There is something reassuring in that neutrality. You step away from the glass and allow your stance to widen slightly, grounding without stiffness. The boards beneath your boots carry a faint memory of earlier warmth, now almost fully cooled. The lantern housing turns again. The gears mesh again. The pendulum swings again. Each cycle feels less like repetition and more like deepening. The boundary between movement and stillness has softened to the point where both seem to exist at once. The tower turns, yet the room feels still. The sea shifts, yet the horizon feels constant. You lean lightly against the inner column, feeling the faint vibration travel through the stone. It is subtle. It is continuous. It does not ask anything of you. The returning tide spreads slowly over the lower rock, smoothing the sharp outlines that were exposed earlier. The water levels the surface, rounding its edges. Light crosses it again. The reflection is dimmer this time, more diffuse, as though the sea has absorbed the brightness rather than mirrored it. You notice how your own awareness feels similarly diffused. There is no single focal point. The beam, the water, the pendulum, the hum all register without competing. You are not tracking time. You are not anticipating the next turn. You are simply within the arc. The wind remains calm. The glass remains steady. The rotation continues. For a moment, you close your eyes again, not to withdraw from the scene, but to let the sensation of turning persist without sight. The hum beneath your palm remains. The tick of the pendulum lands softly. The sea resumes its slow inward breath. When you open your eyes, nothing has shifted dramatically. The tower remains as it was. The beam continues its measured sweep. And yet something has eased further, a final softening of the distinction between watcher and watched. You are not standing in the lighthouse. You are within its rhythm. The sea does not rise toward you. It rises within the same motion you inhabit. The beam does not move across distance. It turns through a shared field of dark and light. The pendulum does not measure minutes. It marks continuity. The tower turns. The tide returns. The night holds. And you remain here not as caretaker alone, but as part of the steady arc that carries light across water and back again, over and over without urgency, without end, without anything required beyond its quiet, patient continuation. The rotation does not pause when you step back from it. It continues. The beam arcs outward across the darkened sea with the same calm precision it has held all evening. The tide has risen enough now that the earlier exposed rock is once again beneath a thin skin of water. The surface appears smoother, though you know the contours remain. You move toward the center of the lantern room once more, not out of obligation, but because the center seems to gather the room's steadiness most clearly. The mechanism turns. The pendulum marks its arc. Tick. The sound lands gently in the space, then fades without echo. You rest both hands lightly against the brass housing. The metal carries a faint warmth, not fresh heat, but the residual trace of long motion. It feels lived in, reliable. There is something grounding about a system that does not demand attention in order to function. You do not need to adjust anything. You do not need to tighten a bolt or recalibrate a weight. The gears are aligned. The beam is clear. The rotation holds its pace. You draw your hands back and let them rest at your sides. The boards beneath your boots feel solid, worn smooth in places by decades of quiet movement. Near the outer curve of the room, you notice again the slight dip in the floor, a place where many steps have passed over years. The wood there carries a softer sheen. You step onto it once more. It holds you easily. The wind outside has thinned to almost nothing. The glass panes remain still. The sky and sea are nearly indistinguishable except when the beam crosses and briefly reveals the difference in texture, sky absorbing, water reflecting. The distinction no longer feels important. You stand at the window and watch the tide continue its slow return. The water spreads gradually over stone that has not seen air for hours. The surface rounds itself. The earlier glisten has settled into a low, steady gleam. There is no dramatic shift, only continuation. The pendulum swings. Tick. The sound does not pull you forward or back. It simply lands, then dissolves into the hum beneath it. You notice how little effort it takes now to remain present here. At the beginning of the evening, your attention traced each adjustment, each surface, each faint vibration. Now the room seems to hold you as much as you hold it. You lean lightly against the inner column once more, feeling the faint transmission of movement through the stone. It is not a tremor. It is closer to a steady pulse, one that does not quicken or slow. The beam completes another arc. Light touches water. Light touches sky. Light withdraws. The rhythm remains unchanged. You draw a breath and feel how the air in the lantern room has cooled slightly. Not sharply, just enough to register the passing of hours. The faint scent of oil and metal lingers, softened by the night air that seeps in through the smallest gaps. There is something comforting in the familiarity of that scent. It does not announce itself. It simply remains. You cross the room slowly, your steps no longer defined by direction. The circular path feels less like a route and more like a gentle orbit. Each step aligns with the turning beam without conscious timing. The rotation continues whether you walk or stand still. You pause beside the railing and rest your palm once more against the worn notch beneath the latch. The indentation fits your hand as though it were shaped for it, though you know it was formed by many different hands over time. The mark does not belong to anyone in particular. It belongs to the tower. You let your fingers trace its smooth curve once more before stepping back. The tide has risen enough now that the lower rocks are almost fully submerged again. Only the faintest outline remains visible between rotations of the beam. Soon even that will disappear. You do not need to wait for it. The pendulum marks another arc. Tick. The sound feels quieter now, not because it has changed, but because the rest of the room has softened around it. The hum of the gears blends more seamlessly with the air. You move to the far side of the lantern room and stand where the beam begins its outward sweep. The moment of ignition, the exact point where brightness leaves the glass and enters open space, feels less distinct now. Light emerges. Light continues. Nothing fractures. There is no sense of guarding or maintaining in your stance anymore. The tower no longer feels like something that must be watched closely. It feels like something that watches alongside you. You rest your back lightly against the stone wall and let your gaze soften. The horizon remains dark. The water rises. The beam turns. The pendulum swings. Tick. The sequence no longer feels like a series of actions. It feels like a single condition unfolding steadily. You notice how your own breathing has aligned almost perfectly with the arc of the light. Inhale as it moves outward. Exhale as it returns. There is no instruction in this. It has simply settled that way. The room feels less enclosed than before. The curved glass no longer frames the sea as something separate. The dark beyond seems continuous with the dim interior light. You close your eyes briefly. The beam still moves. You can sense its passing in the faint change of brightness against your lids. The pendulum still marks its arc. Tick. You open your eyes again and the scene remains unchanged. The tide has risen further, smoothing the earlier edges entirely. The rock is gone from view now. Only water remains. The light crosses it evenly. You step away from the window and let yourself stand in the center of the room once more. The brass housing turns with the same calm certainty it held at the start of the night. There is no tightening, no strain, no escalation. The mechanism has entered its deepest steadiness. And so have you. The tower continues its rotation, whether you attend to it closely or allow your gaze to wander. It does not depend on constant scrutiny. It has its own alignment. You stand quietly within it, not as supervisor, not as guardian, but as part of its rhythm. The sea rises, the beam turns, the pendulum swings, tick, and nothing further is required. The beam continues its patient arc across the water. It does not hurry. It does not linger. It simply completes what it has always completed. You remain where you are, not because you must, but because there is no reason to move. The tower does not require constant motion from you. It holds its alignment. The mechanism keeps its pace. The tide has fully claimed the rocks now. The surface below the lantern room is unbroken, except where the beam briefly sketches a path across it. Each pass of light lays a thin ribbon over the dark, then withdraws without imprint. The water does not hold the beam. It receives it, then releases it. The pendulum swings. Tick. The sound no longer marks time in the way it did earlier in the night. It feels less like measurement and more like confirmation. A gentle assurance that the motion continues without interruption. You move once more toward the railing, but the movement is slight, almost incidental. The boards beneath your feet hold their quiet firmness. The small dip near the outer curve rests where it always has. You step across it without thinking. It feels familiar. There is something reassuring about systems that continue whether you watch them closely or let your attention drift. The gears turn. The light rotates. The sea rises and settles in its own gradual rhythm. You are not directing any of it, you are within it. You draw in a breath that feels deeper than the ones before. The air inside the lantern room has grown cooler still. It carries a faint salt trace from the sea and a quiet warmth from the machinery that never fully fades. The combination lingers gently. You let your hand rest once more on the brass housing, feeling the steady vibration beneath the metal. It is not urgent. It is not strained. It is simply present. The beam crosses the horizon. The water receives it, the sky absorbs it, then darkness folds back in. There is no sense of completion here, only continuation. You stand in the center of the lantern room again, aware of how evenly the space holds you now. The earlier awareness of edges, glass, railing, floorboards has softened into something less defined. The boundaries remain, but they no longer call for attention. The tower is stable, the sea is stable, your stance is stable. The pendulum swings. Tick. The sound lands gently and disappears into the hum that surrounds it. You notice how little distinction remains between watching and being. The beam does not require your focus to remain steady. The tide does not require your observation to rise. The machinery does not depend on your hand resting against it. And yet you are here, not supervising, not adjusting, simply aligned. The lighthouse continues as it always has. Its rotation remains true. You do not need to follow it. You are already within it. The sea gathers its surface beneath the turning light. The tide holds its level. The beam moves outward and returns without variation. The rhythm remains. The night deepens without spectacle. There is no sudden darkening, no shift in tone, only a gradual thickening of quiet that settles into the spaces between sound. You let your eyes soften once more. The pendulum marks its arc. Tick. The sound is softer now, though not because it has changed. It feels distant only because everything else has settled closer. You lean lightly against the inner column and allow the vibration of the mechanism to meet you where you stand. It is not something you must track. It is something you can rest within. The beam completes another sweep. Light across water, light across sky, light withdrawing, you remain. The tower continues as it always has. Its rhythm remains. You do not need to follow it. You are already within it. The night gathers, the quiet holds, and the rest will carry itself.